On May 17th, 2026, Mountain Home Air Force Base, the Gunfighter Skies Air Show, the unthinkable happens. The two jets collide in midair. Millions of dollars of advanced hardware are instantly turned into falling scrap metal. Miraculously, 4 parachutes deploy. Both pilots and both electronic warfare officers survive. When I first saw that footage, my immediate thought was, well, they're gonna have to write another chapter for the ejection manual. But my second thought was, wait, why does this keep happening? Because this isn't an isolated incident. Over the past 3 years, Class A aviation mishaps, which are accidents resulting in over $2.5 million in damage or loss of life, have been steadily creeping up. In 2023, there were 38. In 2024, there were 42. By 2025, that number hit 45. When you see charts trending upward and 2 of America's most vital, scarce assets crashing into each other at an air show, it is very easy to jump to a sensational conclusion. You look at the TikTok, and foreigners are already proclaiming that the United States military is exhausted, fielding ancient equipment, and fundamentally in decline. But is that actually true? Is the US military falling apart? What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. First, let's talk about the EA-18G Growler. It's not just another fighter jet. It is the only manned, dedicated electronic attack aircraft currently in service with the US military. When a carrier strike group launches a strike package, stealth fighters might be the ones kicking down the door, but the Growlers are the ones disabling the alarm system. Their job is to flood the electromagnetic spectrum, jam enemy radars, blind surface-to-air missile batteries, and paralyze hostile communications. If you do not have Growlers paving the way, the survivability of your strike package drops exponentially. In modern warfare, whoever controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the battlefield. And the Growler is the ultimate apex predator in that domain. Here is the problem. The US military only has around 150 of them. That is a microscopic fleet, tasked with carrying the electronic warfare burden for the entire globe. Every time an aircraft carrier deploys to the Pacific, the Middle East, or the Mediterranean, Growlers go with them. They are the first to launch and the last to land. So when you see 2 of these irreplaceable assets smash into each other at an air show, it stings hard. So how did this happen? Official investigations take months, so we cannot definitively assign blame. But based on the footage and the mechanics of high-speed formation flying, we can point to 3 primary factors. Number 1, a microsecond miscalculation. When flying in a tight tactical formation, the trailing pilot relies almost entirely on visual reference points on the lead aircraft. They are not looking at their instruments. They are staring at a rivet or a panel line on the jet in front of them. The margin for error is measured in fractions of a second. If a pilot's peripheral vision falters for a moment, or their hand on the throttle is a millimeter too slow, you have a catastrophic kinetic intersection. Interestingly, former NTSB aviation safety expert Jeff Gussetti noted something crucial about this specific crash. The jets didn't instantly disintegrate upon impact. They remained somewhat locked together, rolling violently before breaking apart. That terrifying, chaotic roll is likely what bought the 4 aviators the precious seconds they needed to pull the ejection handles. It was incredibly lucky. Number 2, the pressure cooker of training. Both of the jets involved belong to VAQ-129, the Vikings. This is a fleet replacement squadron. Their job is to train newly minted naval aviators and electronic warfare officers on how to fly and fight the Growler. There's always a misconception that training squadrons don't need to deploy like regular squadrons, so they have it easy. But the reality is the exact opposite. Instructors in VAQ-129 operate under staggering pressure. They have a highly compressed window to take a pilot who just learned how to land on a carrier and turn them into a combat-ready warrior capable of suppressing a Chinese or Russian air defense network. Number 3, asset overutilization. Because the US is currently managing multiple global crises simultaneously, carrier strike groups are deploying back-to-back. This creates a vicious cycle. The operational squadrons demand more pilots. The training squadrons are forced to accelerate their syllabus to provide those pilots. Instructors are flying more sorties, the jets are flown harder. Maintenance windows are compressed, fatigue sets in. And when you combine fatigue with high-speed, low-altitude formation flying, the probability of a Class A mishap skyrockets. This brings us to the argument that is currently dominating the internet. The US military is failing. Critics point to the fact that the US is still flying legacy airframes like the FA-18 and the B-52, and that the rising accident rate is proof of systemic decay. But is that true? First, regarding old equipment. The fact that the US can take airframes designed 30 or 40 years ago, continuously upgrade their avionics and weapons, and still maintain total air superiority against peer adversaries does not indicate failure. It indicates that the foundational engineering of those platforms was decades ahead of the rest of the world. But what about the accident rate? 45 Class A mishaps in 2025 sounds terrifying, until you look at the denominator. In 2025, the US military flew approximately 3.8 million total flight hours. When you do the math, that equates to a Class A mishap rate of roughly 1.18 per 100,000 flight hours. Let's look back 10 years to 2015. The rate was 1.09. The difference is less than 0.1. Over the last decade, the total volume of US military flight operations has increased by nearly 20%. The total number of accidents increased proportionally. The rate of accidents per hour flown has remained almost statistically identical. What this data proves is that American pilots haven't suddenly forgotten how to fly, and the mechanics haven't forgotten how to turn a wrench. They are just flying significantly more often in much more dangerous environments. Think of it this way. If you have a guy who runs 10 miles every single day, his knees are occasionally going to hurt. If you have a guy who sits on his couch 365 days a year, his knees will never hurt. Does the couch potato have a stronger, healthier body? Of course not. He just isn't testing his limits. The US military is currently running a marathon at a sprint pace, and the reason they are running so hard is because of the responsibility they carry. Over 80% of global maritime trade relies on the security architecture provided by the United States Navy. The amount of oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz every day is enough to power the entire nation of Japan for 48 hours. The cargo volume in the Malacca Strait exceeds the combined total of every port in Europe. If any of these strategic choke points are closed by hostile actors, global supply chains collapse, inflation skyrockets, and economies burn. Who patrols these waters? It isn't the United Nations. It is carrier strike groups and their EA-18G Growlers. With over 800 overseas bases, 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and formal defense treaties with over 40 nations, the US is the load-bearing pillar of global security. The Pentagon cannot simply decide to fly 20% less to save wear and tear on their jets. If they stand down, adversaries step up, so they are forced to run their equipment and their people into the ground. But they aren't just accepting the casualties. The Pentagon is actively using this crisis to force a massive, systemic evolution. The US military knows they cannot simply buy their way out of this problem. Throwing money at a burned-out pilot doesn't stop them from crashing. Instead, the Navy and the Air Force are simultaneously executing a four-pillar strategy to fundamentally change how they operate. Pillar 1. Offloading risk to machines. When you think of military drones, you likely think of the MQ-9 Reaper orbiting at high altitude. But the Navy's vision is much more integrated. Enter the MQ-25 Stingray. It is an unmanned, carrier-based aerial refueling tanker. It has already successfully passed carrier trials. A single MQ-25 can launch and deliver nearly 15,000 pounds of fuel to F-35s and Super Hornets hundreds of miles from the ship. Why is this revolutionary for safety? Because currently, 20% to 30% of all Super Hornet sorties are dedicated purely to refueling other jets. By handing that mundane, repetitive task to a drone, you instantly reduce the number of catapult launches and arrested landings your human pilots have to endure. You save the airframe lifespan of your fighters, and you save the sanity of your pilots. Furthermore, the Navy is aggressively pursuing collaborative combat aircraft program. In the near future, the highly dangerous task of penetrating an enemy air defense network won't be done by a manned Growler. It will be done by an autonomous drone acting as a kinetic decoy and jammer. If it gets shot down, you lose money, not a human life. Pillar 2. Distributed capabilities. Right now, the Navy's electronic warfare eggs are almost entirely in the Growler basket. That single point of failure is a massive strategic vulnerability. To fix this, the Navy is aggressively pursuing the FAXX program, slated for the 2030s. The goal isn't just to replace the airframe, it is to distribute the electronic warfare capability across the entire fleet. By integrating advanced EW suites into unmanned drones, surface ships, and even space-based assets, the Navy ensures that if one platform fails, 10 others can instantly pick up the slack. Pillar 3. Predictive AI maintenance. The Navy is currently testing predictive maintenance algorithms across the FA-18 fleet. Sensors track vibration, temperature, and fluid dynamics in real time. Instead of waiting for an engine bearing to fail mid-flight, the AI analyzes the data and tells the ground crew, bearing number 3 on the left engine will likely fail in 42 hours. Replace it today. The results have been staggering. Unplanned groundings have decreased by nearly a third, and fleet availability has actually increased despite the aging airframes. Pillar 4. Maximizing the synthetic environment. Historically, pilots complained that flying 200 hours a year wasn't enough to maintain combat proficiency. But flying real jets burns fuel, fatigues the airframe, and risks lives. The solution is the massive expansion of high-fidelity synthetic training. Modern simulators are no longer just video games. They are 4K, spherical, 360-degree environments mounted on 6-axis motion platforms that replicate the physical G-forces of flight. Pilots can practice mid-air refueling, complex electronic warfare, and even ejection sequences in absolute safety. For example, VAQ-129, the squadron involved in the Idaho crash, has increased its simulator training hours by 400% over the last 3 years. Pilots are actually becoming more lethal because they can run a suicidal combat scenario in the simulator, die, hit the reset button, and learn from their mistakes without losing a $70 million jet. But all the AI maintenance and drones in the world cannot fix a broken human being. You might assume that fighter pilots, highly paid, highly trained adrenaline junkies, can handle anything. But a recent 2024 report by the GAO painted a very dark picture. They found that roughly 1/4 of naval aviators reported symptoms of moderate to severe fatigue. We are talking about feeling a little sleepy. We are talking about degraded cognitive function, delayed reaction times, inability to maintain focus during complex tactical maneuvers. In the past, the military culture was toxic regarding fatigue. You were expected to push through. If you told your commanding officer you were too tired to fly, you were labeled weak. That heroic macho mentality gets people killed, and the Pentagon finally realized it. In 2023, Naval Air Forces Command instituted hard, punitive limits on duty hours. If a pilot is required to be on duty for more than 14 continuous hours, they cannot fly unless they receive written, dual signature authorization from both their commanding officer and a flight surgeon. If an accident occurs and it is discovered that fatigue was hidden or ignored, the entire chain of command is held accountable. Safety officially superseded heroism. Furthermore, the Navy embedded mental health professionals directly into the squadrons. These aren't doctors sitting in a sterile office in a hospital. They deploy with the pilots. They eat in the same mess hall. They brief with the crews. They become trusted members of the team. By 2025, the number of aviators proactively seeking mental health support increased by 300% compared to 2020. They didn't become weaker. The system finally allowed them to address their human limitations without fear of losing their wings. And perhaps most importantly, the military recognized that the greatest stressor on a pilot doesn't happen in the cockpit. It happens at home. Extended, back-to-back deployments destroy families. To combat this, the military radically upgraded its family support infrastructure. They now provide free childcare during deployments, emergency home repair services, and even pet fostering. Every carrier strike group is assigned a dedicated family liaison officer, available 24/7. When sailors return to home port, they are granted a mandatory 7-day integration period, where they are completely exempt from administrative duties, allowing them to reconnect with their spouses and children. The logic is simple. To retain the pilot, you must support the family standing behind them. And it is working. In 2025, applications to leave flying duties due to family stress plummeted by 34%. You might be asking, What do childcare and psychologists have to do with two jets crashing in Idaho? Everything. Fatigue, anxiety, and marital stress ultimately manifest as a 0.1 second delay in cognitive processing inside a cockpit. And when you were flying 3 feet away from another jet at 400 miles per hour, that 0.1 second delay is the difference between a successful air show and a fireball. When the US military investigates a crash today, they don't just blame the pilot and close the file. They ask systemic questions. How many hours did this pilot sleep last week? Did they have a crisis at home? Was this squadron overscheduled by higher command? Finding the root vulnerability in the system, rather than just scapegoating the operator, is the hallmark of a mature, resilient military organization. A truly formidable military force is not one that never makes mistakes. A truly formidable force is one that recognizes its failures, adapts instantly, and evolves. Are pilots still in short supply? Yes. But the retention rate actually increased in 2025 because the Navy implemented massive retention bonuses, reduced deployment lengths, and started offloading the most exhausting tasks to drones. The crisis isn't fully solved, but the bleeding has stopped. Are the planes old? Yes. The FA-18 platform is 30 years old, but through the Service Life Modification Program, the Navy has extended the structural life of these jets from 6,000 hours to a staggering 10,000 hours. They will keep flying into the 2030s, exactly when the next generation autonomous platforms are ready to take over the most lethal missions. Are the global deployments overwhelming? Yes, but the US is finally forcing its allies to carry their weight. Australia, Japan, and the UK are drastically increasing defense spending. The European members of NATO have increased their defense budgets by an average of 50% over the last decade. The US remains the tip of the spear, but the spear is getting wider. So let's return to the question we asked at the beginning. Is the US military in decline? The collision of those two growlers in Idaho was a tragedy of physics, fatigue, and the brutal demands of high-performance aviation. But the response to that crash, and to the wider crisis facing naval aviation, tells a very different story. We are not watching a military collapse. We are watching a military that is brutally, honestly analyzing its own weaknesses and actively rewiring its technology, its training, and its psychology to ensure it remains the most lethal fighting force on the planet.